The branch floor was never quiet during business hours. Tellers called out numbers, printers hummed, phones rang in short bursts. But on that Thursday afternoon, the noise stopped the moment my branch manager, Patricia Owens, pointed at me in front of 3 customers and 2 junior staff members. "You approved the override, Marcus." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, like she had rehearsed those 4 words in a mirror that morning. My supervisor, Dennis Holt, stood slightly behind her with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed somewhere above my head. The look of a man pretending not to enjoy something he definitely enjoyed. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I said nothing because the shock of it was so clean and sudden that my body simply held still. But my mind was moving fast. I had not approved any override. I had not been in the building when the override happened. My access card had not been swiped past 7 that evening, and the incident had occurred at 9:43. My system ID was printed on the incident report. That part was real. Everything else was a lie built carefully around one true thing. And they were both watching me, waiting to see how I would fall. The break room was the place where you learned the real temperature of a workplace. Not meetings, not performance reviews, the break room. The morning after Patricia's public accusation, I walked in at 7:52 and the conversation between 2 tellers, Rosie and Carl, dropped off like a switch had been flipped. Rosie picked up her phone. Carl turned toward the window. Neither of them would meet my eyes. I poured my coffee slowly. I was not going to rush out of a room I had every right to be in. On my way back to my desk, I caught 3 words from a voice I recognized as Terry Weston's. I thought he was solid. Past tense. Already decided. The rumor had moved faster than I expected. By midday, I received a formal written notice from Human Resources. Probation. Pending investigation into an unauthorized override event on the evening of the 14th. The letter was 2 pages long and used careful language that said very little while implying everything. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly and placed it inside the top drawer of my desk. I breathed in through my nose and counted quietly to 4. They had made their first move. I had not yet made mine. My name is Marcus Cole. I am 38 years old, and for 11 years I worked as an operations supervisor at Crestwood Community Bank, a mid-sized regional bank with 7 branch locations. I was hired as a junior teller straight out of college and worked my way through every layer of the operation. I knew vault procedures, wire protocols, compliance frameworks, and regulatory audit cycles better than most people twice my age. My performance record was clean, not just acceptable, genuinely clean. No complaints, no disciplinary actions, no compliance flags in 11 years. My reviewers used words like meticulous, dependable, and thorough. I was the person they called when something broke at another branch. I was the person staff came to when a transaction did not reconcile. I had earned that reputation through years of quiet, careful, documented work. What made the accusation particularly painful was not just that it was false. It was that the 2 people who made it knew the system because I had taught them. Patricia Owens had been branch manager for 14 months. Dennis Holt had been my direct supervisor for 8. I had personally trained both on override procedures, escalation hierarchies, and dual authentication requirements. Every layer they were now using against me was a layer I had walked them through myself. The incident that started everything happened on the evening of April 14th, a Tuesday. A corporate client named Hargrove Logistics had submitted a large deposit that afternoon. The teller who processed it miskeyed the account number by 1 digit, leaving a significant sum suspended inside the system. These errors had a clear procedure: flag it, log it, escalate it to operations. If it happened after hours, you call the on-call supervisor and documented the chain. Simple, trackable. But Patricia did not follow the procedure. From what I later pieced together, she was still in the building at 9:15 and the error was stressing her out. A corporate client, a large sum, a mistake she felt responsible for fixing. She panicked. Instead of calling the on-call line and creating a proper paper trail, she tried to resolve it herself using an override function that required 2 authenticated supervisors. She had her own credentials. She needed a second set. And that was the moment she made the decision that would define the next 6 months of both our lives. She used mine without my knowledge and without my presence. I was home by then, completely unaware of what was being done in my name on a system that would record every detail of it forever. Override authentication at Crestwood was not a simple password entry. The system required 2 credential sets entered in sequence, with a gap of no more than 90 seconds between first and second input. My credentials, my employee ID, my PIN, and a rotating token from physical key fob were stored separately. The fob was locked in my desk drawer at home. There was no remote access to it. For Patricia to use my credentials that night, she needed to request a temporary escalation through IT, which allowed a senior access code to be applied to a transaction under documented emergency circumstances. That emergency function existed for genuine crises. It was not meant for covering up a processing error at 9:43 on a Tuesday night, but it could be used that way if someone with enough system access wanted to push a transaction through and backfill the documentation afterward. The timestamp on the incident report showed my credentials appearing alone, without the paired entry that proper dual authentication required. That was the first crack in their story. It was technically impossible for my credentials to appear that way through normal authorization. I knew at the moment I read the report, because I wrote the procedure manual that described exactly how this sequence was supposed to work. They called me into Dennis's office 3 days after the public accusation. Patricia was already seated in the corner chair, which told me the meeting had been arranged to feel casual, but was anything but. Dennis leaned back with the practiced ease of a man who wanted to appear in control. He said the bank valued my contributions. He said sometimes good people made quick decisions under pressure that did not follow protocol perfectly, and the bank preferred to resolve those situations quietly. Then he looked at me directly and said, "Take responsibility for the override. Marcus, say it was a judgment call. This goes away quietly, and you keep your position." I let the silence sit for 4 full seconds before I responded. Not because I was unsure of my answer, but because I wanted him to feel the weight of what he had just asked me to do. Then I said, "I would like full access to the raw system logs from the evening of April 14th. Dennis's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Patricia moved very slightly in her chair. "We will look into that," Dennis said. The meeting ended 30 seconds later. I walked back to my desk and opened a new folder on my personal laptop. I named it Documentation. I submitted a formal written request for the access logs the same afternoon, copying both Dennis and the IT department head. The response from IT arrived 2 days later and used the phrase scheduled system maintenance to explain why the logs were not immediately available. I read that email 3 times. Scheduled maintenance did not typically affect archived transaction logs. Those records were stored in a separate environment specifically to remain accessible during operational disruptions. The timing of this maintenance window was strange. The notice had not appeared on the shared IT calendar visible to all supervisory staff. It had not been announced in the weekly operations briefing. It appeared, fully formed, only after I submitted my log request. I did not send a follow-up email asking for clarification. I did not call the IT desk to push. I simply noted the date of the response, saved the email, and began keeping a handwritten log in a small notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. Every conversation, every timestamp, every name, I wrote in plain language with no abbreviations, because I intended everything I recorded to be readable by someone who had never set foot in that building. I was not yet sure who that person would be, but I was certain they would come eventually. After the meeting with Dennis and the delayed IT response, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had. I decided not to fight publicly. Not yet. Silence, when applied correctly, is not weakness. It is pressure of a different kind. When you go quiet after being accused of something, the people who accuse you have 2 choices. They can escalate, which creates paperwork and scrutiny. Or they can wait, assuming your silence means you are broken and the situation is settling in their favor. Dennis and Patricia were the kind of people who would wait. I had read them correctly over months of working alongside both. They would interpret my silence as resignation. They would relax. And relaxed people make mistakes. Within 2 weeks of my decision to stay quiet, I noticed Patricia beginning to adjust documentation. Not dramatically. A timestamp moved here. A summary line reworded there. The kind of edits that look like routine housekeeping if you're not watching. But I was watching everything. I kept my notebook current every single day. And I understood something they clearly did not. That a person who has done nothing wrong and knows exactly where the truth is buried can afford to wait longer than the people trying to hide it. The first altered document I caught was the audit copy of the April 14th incident report. Our branch kept 2 versions of every incident record, a printed copy filed in the compliance binder and a digital copy uploaded to the internal audit portal. During a routine reconciliation task, I had reason to check both versions and noticed a 2-minute difference in one timestamp. 2 minutes sounds small. In banking compliance, 2 minutes can be the difference between a properly escalated authorization and an unauthorized transaction. The digital version showed the override occurring at 9:41. The physical copy showed 9:43. The original system entry, which I had briefly glimpsed in Dennis's presence weeks earlier, had read 9:43. Someone had moved the digital record backward by 2 minutes. The adjustment made the override appear to fall inside a narrow window that permitted single supervisor authorization under a little-known emergency provision in the compliance manual. It was precise and technical, made by someone who understood the rules deeply enough to find the one gap that might make the falsified record defensible. I photographed both documents with my personal phone, dated the photographs, and added them to my documentation folder. Then I kept working without saying a word to anyone. 6 weeks after the accusation, Dennis delivered the formal demotion in writing. My authority level was reduced from operations supervisor to senior teller, which meant I lost override privileges, transaction approval authority, and the ability to escalate compliance issues independently. On paper, it was framed as a temporary reassignment pending the internal review. In practice, it changed how everyone in that building treated me. Customers who had known me for years and regularly requested my help were redirected to Patricia or to junior supervisors she had appointed. I processed standard deposits and counted cash drawers. The humiliation was not subtle, but I had decided it was useful. While I worked behind a teller window doing tasks I could do in my sleep, I was listening and watching more clearly than I ever had from a supervisor's desk. 3 weeks into the demotion, I overheard Dennis say casually to someone on the phone that corporate had scheduled a routine audit for 6 months out. He mentioned it the way people mention things they believe will never catch up to them. I went home that evening and wrote the date in my notebook. Then I underlined it twice and circled it once. I had a deadline now, and I intended to be ready before it arrived. By October, Dennis and Patricia believed the situation was resolved. The internal review had concluded with a finding vague enough to be meaningless, procedural concerns addressed, and had been quietly filed away. My probation had technically been lifted, though my authority had not been restored. One afternoon in October, I was passing Dennis's office and caught his voice through the partially open door. He was on the phone, and he said, relaxed and certain, "By the time audit hits, this will be old news. Nobody is going to dig up a 6-month-old override error." He sounded genuinely comfortable. I kept walking and said nothing. But that evening, I made a discovery that changed the landscape of everything I was preparing for. While reviewing a compliance training document I had helped write 2 years earlier, I found a reference to the bank's archiving policy for core system data. Core banking servers, the ones sitting off-site at the data center, retained raw transaction logs permanently and without any ability to be edited retroactively. Only branch-level summary documents could be modified. The raw data, recorded at the millisecond level by the core system at the moment each action occurred, was completely untouched and untouchable. Patricia had been editing the wrong layer entirely. The distinction between raw system logs and branch-level summaries was something most staff at Crestwood never needed to think about. Branch employees worked with the summary layer, the formatted reports that appeared on internal dashboards and printed compliance files. Those are the documents Patricia had been quietly adjusting. But beneath the summaries, the core banking system recorded every credential input, every transaction sequence, and every authentication attempt in a raw format stored in an off-site archive. Those logs could not be accessed or modified by anyone at the branch level. They were pulled only during formal audits or regulatory reviews. They had not been touched since April 14th. No one at the branch could reach them. When the corporate audit team arrived, they would not request the branch summary copies. They would pull directly from the archive. Patricia had spent months carefully editing documents that the auditors would never even open. She had left the only layer that mattered completely intact. I said nothing to anyone about what I had found. I simply updated my documentation binder to include a clear explanation of the two-layer system and how each layer would be reviewed during a formal audit. Then I began preparing the rest of my materials with renewed focus. The thing about staying silent and working flawlessly is that it changes how people around you behave. When you stop protesting and simply perform, and perform well, it creates uncertainty in the people who wronged you. They expected bitterness and declining performance. When they did not get that, they did not know what to do with it. I made no errors during those 6 months. Not one transaction discrepancy, not one compliance flag, not one customer complaint. My drawer balanced every single day. My documentation was clean and my conduct was professional. I made myself operationally untouchable, not to impress Dennis or Patricia, but because I knew that when the audit came, the contrast between my record and their conduct needed to be as wide and as clear as possible. Meanwhile, Patricia grew comfortable with the situation. She stopped double-checking her adjustments. She stopped using the careful, deliberate language she had used in those early weeks when she was still worried. By December, she was making decisions with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed they had already won. Comfortable people stop watching their own tracks. And a person who stops watching their tracks in a system that records everything is a person who has already begun to lose. In the second week of December, Patricia approved another override transaction without following proper escalation protocol. It was a smaller amount, a routine wire correction for a business client, but the system logged it in exactly the same way as the April event. Single credential authorization on a transaction that required dual authentication. She had not used my credentials this time. She simply pushed the transaction through under her own access code and filled in the escalation field afterward with a vague notation. The branch summary made it look clean, but the raw system log would record the same pattern it always did. One credential set on a transaction that required two, with no time-stamped dual authentication sequence. She had done it because it was faster and because she no longer believed anyone was watching carefully enough to notice. I noticed. I did not report it. I added it to my binder with a note explaining the specific compliance provision it violated and how the raw log would reflect the gap. One incident could be explained as a pressure-driven judgment call. 2 incidents, 8 months apart, following the same structural pattern, told a completely different story. The word for that story was not mistake. The word was practice. By the end of January, I had mapped the full timeline across 9 months of available records. Working from memory, saved emails, photographed documents, and publicly accessible transaction summaries, I built a pattern analysis. Override requests at our branch had originated from Patricia's terminal on 6 separate occasions over a 14-month period. My credentials appeared in 2 of those instances, both times appearing after her credential input in the raw sequence, which was the technical signature of escalation abuse. A subordinate credential appearing in the second slot indicated it had been forced through the hierarchy rather than entered directly by its owner. I had 3 colleagues at other branches who had mentioned, in casual conversation over the years, similar irregularities during Patricia's time at previous locations. I noted their names for potential reference if the audit team chose to expand its scope. Then, in the 3rd week of February, I arrived at work on a Monday morning and found 3 people in the lobby I had never seen before. They wore visitor badges and carried structured laptop cases. The regional compliance team had arrived 1 week ahead of schedule. I walked to my station, organized my drawer, and waited. Everything I had spent 6 months preparing was about to become necessary. The audit team arrived at 8:15 without announcement. Patricia was already at her desk, and I watched from the teller area as her posture changed the moment she recognized the compliance officer leading the group, Director Carmichael, known throughout the regional network for being precise and patient in equal measure. Dennis emerged from his office within 90 seconds, straightening his jacket. His smile was the performance of a confident man, but his hands moved to his pockets and stayed there. Over 8 months, I had learned that was what Dennis did when he was not actually confident. Director Carmichael introduced her team and stated they were conducting a full branch compliance review with particular focus on override transaction history and authentication records going back 14 months. Dennis said they were welcome to anything they needed. Patricia echoed the same. I returned to my station and processed a savings deposit for a customer named Mr. Alvarado, who was celebrating his granddaughter's first birthday. I counted his cash back twice, as I always did. When he left, I straightened my workspace and kept working. I did not look toward the conference room. I did not monitor what was happening with the audit team. I already knew what they were going to find. I had known for months. They brought me into the conference room at 11:45. Fluorescent lights. Cold air. Director Carmichael sat directly across from me. Officer Reyes, the authentic. Then I said, carefully and without accusation, I believe the raw logs from the core archive will clarify the authentication sequence from April 14th. Officer Reyes looked up from the timeline. Director Carmichael set down her pen. She asked her team to pull the archive data. The room was quiet for several minutes while the request was processed remotely. I kept my hands flat on the table and my breathing steady. When the raw logs appeared on the screen, I did not look at Officer Reyes or Director Carmichael. I looked at the data. The sequence was exactly what I had known it would be for 6 months. Officer Reyes walked through the raw data methodically, narrating as she went. The April 14th sequence appeared in the log exactly as I had anticipated. Patricia's credential set initiated the transaction at 9:41 and 2 seconds. A system flag appeared 3 seconds later, indicating dual authentication was required. Then, at 9:41 and 48 seconds, 46 seconds after the flag, a secondary credential was applied. The sequence flag on that secondary entry read escalation triggered, not direct entry. That single code was the difference between authorization and credential abuse. My credential had not been entered manually that night. It had been pulled into the transaction through the IT emergency escalation function. That function required a specific access level to invoke, a level not available to Patricia. It was available to Dennis. Director Carmichael looked at Officer Reyes. Officer Reyes looked at the screen. The room held a particular stillness, the kind that follows a discovery, not a conversation. Director Carmichael then asked for all internal email correspondence between branch management staff from April 14th through May 31st. She asked for it to be pulled from the bank's own email archive, not from branch-held copies. She was being careful. She had already seen enough to understand why careful mattered here. The email review took 40 minutes. I sat at my teller station, processed transactions, and said nothing to anyone. At 12:50, Director Carmichael stepped out and asked me to return to the conference room. When I sat down, she turned a laptop screen toward me and asked if I recognized the email thread displayed. It was dated April 16th, 2 days after the incident, 2 days before the internal review began. Patricia had written to Dennis, "The timestamp issue needs to be cleaned up before this gets flagged. Can you handle it from your end?" Dennis had responded 11 minutes later, already on it. "The digital copy is updated. Just make sure the printed version in the binder matches." The emails were time-stamped, sender-verified, and stored in the bank's own archive, the same system the compliance team had full access to during any official audit. Neither Dennis nor Patricia had thought to clear them. They had communicated their plan to falsify documentation through the network they should have known would be examined. I did not say anything after Director Carmichael showed me the thread. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed my documentation binder on the table. "I have been keeping records," I said quietly. 6 months of them. I thought they might be useful. The shift in the room after I placed the binder on the table was immediate. Director Carmichael looked at it, then at me, then at Officer Reyes and said to a colleague, "Get Director Okafor on the line." While the call was being connected, she turned to Dennis and Patricia, who had been brought into the room 10 minutes earlier. She asked them directly, "Did either of you alter internal branch documentation following the April 14th override event?" The question landed like something dropped from height. Dennis looked at the table. Patricia looked at Dennis. Neither answered for 4 full seconds. In banking compliance, for seconds of silence in response to a direct yes or no question from a regional director is not a pause. It is an answer. Director Carmichael noted the time on her tablet and stated she was formally escalating the investigation to the regional operations level. She asked both Dennis and Patricia to remain available for further questioning and to surrender their access credentials to her team, pending the expanded review. The branch investigation had just become considerably larger than a branch matter. I looked at neither of them as they were directed to separate waiting areas. I simply sat at the table with my binder and waited for whatever instruction came next. At T2:15 that afternoon, Human Resources delivered written notices of immediate administrative leave to both Dennis and Patricia. They were escorted out of the building quietly, without announcement, within 20 minutes. The staff watched from behind glass-walled offices. No one spoke during it. After they left, a particular stillness settled over the floor. Not the uncomfortable silence of the morning after the accusation. Something more like the quiet that follows the end of a long storm. Terry Weston came to my station at 3 o'clock. He was the one who had said in the break room that he thought I was solid, past tense. Now he stood at my window and said, "Marcus, I owe you an apology." I told him he did not, because he had made a judgment based on the information he had at the time. I did not hold that against anyone. At 4:15, I received a call on my work extension from the regional director's office. They asked me to come in the following morning for a meeting at headquarters. They described it as a conversation, not a review, and asked me to bring my documentation binder. I told them I would be there. That evening I went home, made dinner, and slept better than I had in 6 months. The regional director's office was on the 14th floor and had windows that looked out over the city. Director Okafor was a measured man in his mid-50s who had been with the bank for 23 years. He stood when I entered, which was the first signal that this meeting would be different from anything in the past 6 months. He said, before anything else, "Mr. Cole, the bank owes you a formal apology, and I intend to deliver it personally." He then stated, clearly and on the record, with 2 members of the legal team present, that the compliance review had confirmed misuse of the escalation hierarchy on April 14th, that my credentials had been applied without my knowledge through an unauthorized use of the IT emergency escalation function, and that my conduct throughout the entire period had been exemplary. He slid a letter across the desk, printed on bank letterhead and signed by both him and the chief compliance officer. It stated that my record had been fully cleared of all findings related to the April 14th incident, and that the probation notation had been removed from my personnel file, effective immediately. I read every sentence carefully. Then I looked up and said, "Thank you." 2 words. They were enough. After the formal apology, Director Okafor mentioned the bank was considering offering me interim branch leadership while a permanent appointment was determined. It was a reasonable and generous offer. But before I responded, I reached into my bag and placed my documentation binder on his desk. I explained that it contained 6 months of pattern analysis, timestamp comparisons, altered document evidence, and a written risk assessment identifying 3 specific gaps in the bank's branch-level authentication oversight that had allowed escalation abuse to occur without triggering an automatic compliance alert. I told him the binder was not only a record of what had been done to me, it was a map for preventing it from happening to anyone else at any branch in the network. Director Okafor did not look at the binder with surprise. He looked at it the way someone looks at something that confirms what they already suspected about a person. He passed it to the compliance officer beside him and turned back to me. He said the bank had been discussing the need for a restructured oversight role and that my binder had just demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that role required. Then he asked whether I would be open to discussing a permanent leadership position rather than an interim one. My promotion to branch operations manager was formally announced on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after the regional directors meeting. The announcement went through the official internal